Welcome to the Manumission podcast, the show dedicated to unshackling ourselves from the status quo. Here's your host, H.H. Morris.
Howdy, friends. I hope you're all having a good weekend. I'm here with my friend Jameson. Say hi. Hope you can hear that. Well, I have a lot to cover today, so I wanted to just jump right into it. I wanted to discuss culture. I know there's a lot of things happening in the news, so I might just do another episode in a few days dealing with everything that's going on with Trump and his war on the media and journalists and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very interesting and a lot of things that we can learn from that and, a lot of things to analyze there. But I wanted to talk about culture today, and I wanted to point out to you why, in my opinion at least, I believe that today, as of today, that I believe that the left poses a bigger threat than the right. And now, had you talked to me during the Bush years, and if I had an outlet like this, if I had a podcast back then, you would have heard, possibly, or not possibly, outright the fact that I thought the opposite back then, mainly because of the wars and the foreign policy that was just an absolute disaster. But so what I want to do is I want to take you back through history, starting with, the 20th, in the beginning of the 20th century, and show you how some of these things have gone back and forth. And I know I've talked about this in previous episodes, but I want to talk about this more from a cultural perspective so we can kind of see why it is that we are where we are today, why the left is the way it is today, and support my opinion, or at least try to make you see why I hold the opinion that today the left poses a bigger threat than the right. And by the way, what you might think that I think the right is today, I think it'll surprise you, because it's not what the right was when, like I mentioned before, I was railing against it during the Bush administration. So all of that is very, very interesting. So please stay with me and indulge me, because I might take the long way home on this, all right? But I think you'll learn a lot from this. But I wanted to begin first by making a few observations. So one, I wanted to talk about action and reaction. And if we realize that everything that we do is either action or reaction, and most of the time it's reaction, because when we take an action, it's usually when we're reacting to something or someone, right? As human beings, all of human history has been just a series of action and reaction. Even in the cases where we think we're acting, spontaneously, we're usually reacting to something, whether it's in our environment, what someone did or said, and then other people react to those things that we do or say, and so on and so forth. Again, whether they be good or bad or indifferent, that's what human history boils down to. Right? I think most people see that, although you probably haven't thought about it explicitly like that, but that's really all it is. And when we recognize that, we can start seeing how all of this happens, how we have this pendulum swing, left, right, left, right, left, right throughout history, and why sometimes the left, looks different than the right, and why the next time it swings left, it actually looks different than the last time it was on the left, and so on and so forth, right? And so how does that come into play when we're talking about culture? Well, I wanted to start with the pendulum all the way in the left in the beginning of the progressive era. So we're talking, late 19th century, early 20th century. Again, by definition, it's a progressive era. So, we're starting with the pendulum on the left, and realize again that there were some, Republican progressives like Teddy Roosevelt and stuff like that. But for the most part, these progressives were Democrats, left-wingers, and progressives essentially were those people that came to the realization or the conclusion that the state was a tool to be used for essentially social engineering, or for a tool to be used to create society and kind of mold culture, if you will. Now, the right at this time was what we would call the Paleo Right, as I've discussed in previous episodes, especially the one where I discussed the political spectrum, if you remember, I mentioned that the right was essentially at this time was traditionalist. It was all about localism. So it was about, the family unit, society, their communities, their local organizations, their churches. And so kind of by default, that made them non-interventionist because they didn't want to get involved in other people's things, just like they didn't want people getting involved in their business. And it kind of by default, that also made them kind of like free market people because, again, if you're not looking for the federal government to get involved in anything, then again, that also extends to things like commerce and whatever decisions you make about, your life, your work, your finances, etc. And for a very long time, Republicans didn't have a lot of power. A lot of people don't realize that, Republicans were kind of a minority party for a large part of the 20th century, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. And basically it was the left that was mainstream. So the mainstream left, who were progressives, was made up of, again, these kind of middle of the road leftists, but it also had its socialist and communist, contingents. But something happened after World War II. After World War II, you saw the right finally starting to get interested in foreign policy and in foreign affairs. So the United States had just come out of a large war. You had the rise of the Soviet Union and the threat that posed, and the Cold War, obviously. And so you started to see how the right became more of what we traditionally associate with the right, with being more patriotic and being more about protecting the homeland and all of these types of things. And at the same time, what started happening is because of the rise of the Soviet Union, because of the rise of Maoist China and all of those things, the left started, and progressives in a lot of ways started to lose a lot of credibility, because now a lot of the things that, some of their contingents, again, the socialists and the communists and all that stuff, the things that they clamored for were now being put into place to terrible results, right? So then people started saying, no thanks, we're seeing it. We're seeing how terrible things are in the Soviet Union, what an absolute tyrannical and repressive and oppressive government that is. Look at China as well. So the pendulum started to swing to the right, all right? So again, the failures of communism then led to that vacuum of power on the left. And the left at that point made a tactical decision. And they said, you know what? In order to kind of try to gain back or wrest back power and clout, we're going to co-opt the causes of all these different groups. And they decided to essentially co-opt all of the causes of groups like the feminists and blacks and other minorities, but mainly blacks. That was the biggest block at that time. You didn't have as many minorities or disparate minorities as you do today. It was mainly blacks. You had them, picking up the mantle for atheists and secularists, even though they had always done as progressives, but even more so. And in that category also put the environmentalists, because they were essentially, that was their religion. It became environmentalism. And in that kind of the same vein, you also had the anti-war movement and the like, right? So all these different groups of, counterculture, what then became counterculture, these were the radicals and activists. So they were no longer the mainstream. And this was essentially a calculated decision that the Democrats and the left took, starting in the 60s and 70s. And then they finally were able to kind of get back into the mainstream by picking up all of those different groups and their causes. And now, in the media has always really been progressive, and it's always been on the left. But this kind of was supercharged during this period when we're talking about now what we would know more as the new left. But like I said, it was it started getting supercharged at this point. They also took over academia, in that, again, they were always in academia. You always had a lot of people who were kind of leftist, but again, it was earlier in the century that was tempered by the fact that, again, a lot of the elites and the intellectuals were actually on the right. But now it became a decisively leftist bulwark. And then they also took over Hollywood. Now, Hollywood was always pretty conservative. And if you remember, the movies of the 50s and back, and they were all very patriotic, and they were all about, conservative topics, and there were no expletives, no bad words, no nudity, no nothing. And again, even if the actors themselves, even if the writers, maybe even some of the producers, whatever, were kind of left-wingers, the studios themselves were usually run by conservatives. I mean, they were big businesses and all that kind of stuff, so that kind of stands to reason. But it wasn't until later, again, the 60s, 70s, and forward, that essentially Hollywood became just another outlet for leftists. All right. And a lot of people, forget about that. They just think, oh yeah, Hollywood is, lefty and this and that. But that wasn't always the case. I mean, think of, Charlton Heston and Ronald Reagan and, the Duke and all those folks that made a lot of these movies, and they were, famously, conservative folks. So now that the left started to become part of the mainstream again, now it was mainstream even though they weren't necessarily the majority. So they became mainstream because they had these outlets, because everybody was being funneled through their schools, and everything that you saw on TV and on the big screen, was left wing, and because most of the journalism again was being filtered through leftist outlets and all that kind of stuff, then it kind of started to give them more power than that they actually had in terms of numbers, population. But that also helped them keep growing and growing and growing. So you saw, throughout the 80s and even into the 90s, that was kind of the pendulum swing that was coming right back, starting to move back towards the left. And then you get into the Clinton years, what I call the Pax Clintonia, tongue in cheek. And I kind of see that as being kind of the pendulum at the center, right? Kind of going right back to the center. And I don't say that as a compliment to Clinton. But I think it is a good example of kind of the moderate left, at least, in that time period. Because, first of all, let's look at a few things about that time period. The only reason why Clinton won, the first time after George H.W. Bush was because of, the third party candidate, Ross Perot, an independent. Because had he not run, it was just between Bush and Clinton. It was most likely that Bush would have won. But, there were a lot of things that you wouldn't associate with the left in terms of Bill Clinton and his presidency. Like, he did have his foreign interventions, like, Iraq and Yugoslavia and all that kind of stuff. If you see there's a lot of videos going around right now about, his State of the Union address. I don't remember what year, when he was talking about, strong border and stronger immigration laws and all that kind of stuff. And, he was for, against gay marriage. And if you guys remember, some of you might remember, basically threw a bone to the left by saying, okay, we're not going to allow gays in the military, but we're going to instate a don't ask, don't tell policy. So essentially, we're not going to go on witch hunts here, but just keep it to yourself. Don't act out and blah, blah, blah. And, you'll be fine. So a lot of things that we would consider very moderate right now. And it's not because, he wasn't a leftist. I think he is, but I think more than anything, the Clintons are pragmatic, which is they just want to be in power, and they will say and do whatever they need to do. They're much more, they're not socialist, communist, leftists like someone like Obama is at heart. They're more pragmatic, progressives, and so they'll say and do anything just to be in power, and they'll take it from there. They'll throw some bones out there to the right sometimes, some bones out there to the left. But, as long as they're in power, they're happy. So then we had this kind of swing. That pendulum was swinging still to the left because of this kind of Pax Clintonia, where everybody started saying, "Oh yeah, see, things can be fine, and we can have growth, and we can have all these things." And people were under the impression that everything was fine and dandy in the 90s under Clinton. And that kind of precipitated this kind of swing leftward, at least towards the Democrats. But that came to a halt when George W. Bush ran for president. And to me, this is more of a fluke that it didn't keep swinging leftwards, because this was a very contentious election. For those of you that remember, a lot of people think that it was basically gifted to George W. Bush because there were by the Supreme Court, because there was an issue, and basically it was all about Florida. They had some issues with the votes there, the hanging chads and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to go back through that history, but essentially that kind of halted that swing to the left with George Bush's election. And then we had things like 9/11. So 9/11, given that was the biggest attack in the mainland in U.S. history, that kind of took and swung that pendulum right back to the right very, very quickly. And that was and I was kind of caught up in that. I've been very upfront about this. I pretty much, my period as a more of a conservative and neocon was right after 9/11, when I said, hey, we need to do something about this. We can't just sit back and pretend and blah, blah, blah. And I kind of fell for the rhetoric at first, and you had the resulting war in Afghanistan, then into Iraq. And then what kind of brought that swing to the right to a halt was, one, at this point, 8 years, almost 8 full years of war, and people were just war weary. They were done with the wars. They were like, this has gotten out of control. A lot of our kids are dying. We're not really seeing much progress. Like, what is the deal? What is going on? But then kind of what sealed the deal was the economic collapse in 2008. And that pretty much sealed the fate of the Republican candidate after Bush. Obviously, he could no longer run again. In that year, it was John McCain. So that kind of brought the pendulum swinging back to the left with Barack Obama. Again, people were done with the wars. They were sick of the way all of this foreign policy was being mismanaged, and then throw on top of that the fact that how many people had lost their jobs and lost their life savings in the economic collapse, and that was a perfect storm for someone like Barack Obama to come into power. Sorry about that. Taking a sip of my Jameson here. So with Barack Obama, with the election of Barack Obama, we had this brisk swing to the left. And this kind of brought this renewed energy from the left. And we saw this, again, not only with his election, but the fact that he had control over both the Senate and the House, and they were able to do a lot of things real quick. And probably the one that is most important here in his first 2 years before he lost the House again in 2010 or whatever it was Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And again, they were only able to do that because he had the presidency, the House, and the Senate. But again, now we're talking about real leftist momentum. Okay, so unlike Clinton, where again we're talking about more moderate stuff, where he was being much more pragmatic about the cultural aspects, the Barack Obama years were basically just hyperdrive into leftism, in that the left, even the most extreme segments of the left, felt like they now actually had an ally and they actually had a voice, and that they could start putting into place a lot of the things that they had been talking about for a long time. So you saw things like, finally gays in the military. You saw things like the appointments of a couple of very left-wing jurists in the Supreme Court of the U.S. with Kagan and Sotomayor. You had finally, that led to, same-sex marriage. And all of this kind of came to a head over the last few years of Barack Obama's presidency with just this rise of the social justice warrior fascism that we saw all over academia and the media, not just the journalism media, but in social media, just across the board. Social justice warriors basically telling everybody what they can and cannot say, what they can and cannot do. The fact that the government can come in and tell individual private businesses what they can't do, how they have to treat people. All of that stuff kind of just went berserk. You guys remember that? That was not too long ago. But all of that while he also expanded the wars. I've talked about this before, and in a few episodes ago when I went off on leftists and about how hypocritical they were about, what their support for Hillary Clinton and all that kind of stuff and everything that they are railing against with Trump, while they were just fine when Obama was doing it, right? The drone program, the debacles that were Benghazi, the debacle that was Libya, the debacle that was Syria and the rise of ISIS, which they supported and armed, and Yemen, you name it, a bunch of different examples of that. But again, like I mentioned in that episode, the left didn't care because of all the other things that I mentioned, all that other list that I had just went through. They were fine. They were appeased by all of these things because the pendulum had swung to the left so hard that they were willing to give him a pass, and obviously they were willing to give Hillary Clinton the pass when she started running for president. So because of that, again, remember, action, reaction. So this swing to the left, that action, right, that became, which was a reaction from the previous administration, now had its own reaction, which was Trump, right? And so what led to that? Well, a few things. All of those things that I mentioned in terms of just this leftism kind of gone awry and go just completely balls to the wall. But also the fact that throughout those 8 years, we, after that collapse of 2008, people would just blame all of that on George W. Bush. So Obama had, at least his whole first term where people just explain away the fact that, the economy wasn't recovering and saying, oh, well, he inherited it. Oh, it's Bush's fault and all that kind of stuff. So he got kind of a pass for a while. And, coupled with the fact that he got a pass all his 8 years from the media, they would never give him any really tough, challenging questions. They would pretty much rubber stamp everything he did. And very rarely would you ever see him, having to be on his toes or even back on his heels in front of the media. They just basically kowtowed to him at every opportunity. But what happened is that it's very clear now, and for those people who are intellectually honest and who have actually looked at this stuff, it's very clear that his economic recovery was a phony economic recovery. The fact that he had to give almost $1 trillion in bailouts, 0% interest rates for, I don't know how long, effectively 0% interest rates. The jobs, of all the jobs that came back, they were mostly either government jobs or service sector jobs. And, the same quality of jobs never really came back. And that for the first time ever, he was a president that the economy didn't even reach 3% growth in any year of his 8 years in power. Okay, so, for all of the things that leftists try to say, oh, he turned things around and basically was inherited a mess from Bush, and look what he's done. Look at how low the unemployment rate is and all that stuff. And again, they don't look at more numbers, right? The number is, it's 4.5% employment rate. Well, yeah, that's because there are so many millions of people that are completely out of the workforce that never even tried to get jobs again, that number is so low. Because if you also have to look at the number of people out of the workforce, which is something like close to 1 million people, and that's the highest that's been in almost half a century, right? But again, that's always, partisan nonsense. But all right, so how did that, again, all of that kind of started swinging the pendulum back to the right in terms of just the negative circumstances regarding or resulting from the Obama administration. But then on top of that, you had Hillary as the candidate now. And the problem with that was that her only accomplishments as either a senator or a secretary of state were pretty much reminiscent of George W. Bush. I mean, she was a neocon in a pantsuit. And I've talked about this before as well. You guys know this, that she had more in common with someone like Dick Cheney than she did with Obama. I mean, she had voted for the wars. She had voted to keep funding the wars. As a Secretary of State, she was part and parcel of all the debacles that happened in the Middle East, in Ukraine, all the crap that started going down with and against Russia, blah, blah, blah. So obviously, and that's what's funny, that at that point, the pendulum swinging back to the right was so scary to all of these people on the left who had felt empowered, in the previous 8 years. They were so scared of Trump that they were willing to support someone like Hillary, who, had it been, earlier, they would never have supported. I mean, again, they were railing against Bush, 8 years before that, and she was, again, basically his clone. So, and on top of that, the social justice warrior lunacy just reached all-time highs over the last couple of years before the election. I mean, this is when we saw people in universities calling for safe spaces and people getting kicked out or fired from their jobs because they said the wrong thing or whatever it was, that people were just absolutely going crazy, and they were sick of this kind of political correctness, this soft fascism of language and of all these things that people had just had enough of. So this movement, this kind of swing back to the right, looks a little different, though. In some ways, a lot different than the previous swing to the right, under Bush and all that kind of stuff. Because now, this swing to the right, which, they call themselves the new right or the alt-right. And before they were the same thing. It was just the alt-right, but they kind of split because I've mentioned before that Richard Spencer, the guy that came up with the term alt-right, I believe, or at least he credits himself for coming up with it. He wasn't very well known at the time, and people didn't know kind of what his point of view was very, very much. And so he was kind of wrapped into all the other, right-wing movements that were surging, and until he kind of felt emboldened enough to be able to talk more freely about his stuff. And it turns out that he's basically more of a white nationalist, type and blah, blah, blah. And at that point, a lot of the other people, more of the mainstream folks, kind of broke with him, and they either outright disavowed, what he was saying, or just completely cut all communication and all contact with the guy. So, he and his ilk still consider themselves the alt-right, but they have essentially marginalized themselves significantly. And if anybody tells you that the alt-right movement is the base of Trump's movement, they're lying, because that is absolutely not the case. I've told you guys before, I follow all of these folks. I go to the deepest, darkest, dankest parts of the internet to find extremists on both sides, all the way from the neo-Nazi, and I mean real neo-Nazi KKK guys, all the way down to the Antifa, crazy communist, anarcho-communist kooks, because I want to see what they're saying. And it's fun to hear some of the nonsense that they spout. And I can tell you for a fact, the alt-right is tiny. It is almost non-existent in terms of the mass population. Do they exist? Yes. Are they bigots? Yes. But they have zero control, zero power, very little credibility. Were they empowered with the rise of Trump? Absolutely. Absolutely. Were the communists and the Antifas and all these people empowered when Obama came into power? Abso-freaking-lutely. It's to be expected, right? They see someone that's closer to, who they are, I mean, even Obama himself was surrounded by communists and, self-proclaimed socialists. He had, Valerie Jarrett and Van Jones and Cal Sunstein. He came up with Bill Ayers and, with Reverend Wright and all these people. He was surrounded by these guys. So obviously you would expect, those fringe groups on the left to be empowered and emboldened during the Obama years, and they were. Now, were they the mainstream of leftism? No. But I can tell you that it was much, much bigger than what the alt-right is to the right today. Now, the new right, here's what's interesting to me. The new right, again, think about this, action versus reaction. So the new right essentially looks at the last 8 years, and they see how they've eventually been trying to be marginalized by the news media, by Hollywood, by academia. And so now they say, you know what, screw off. We're just going to support Trump. And as a big FU to you, we're basically just giving you the finger. And we're no longer interested in things like religion. You never hear these guys talk about religion, right? Very few of them ever bring up religion, even if they are religious themselves. I mean, think of Bill Mitchell. Think of Stefan Molyneux. Think of Mike Cernovich, of Vox Day. A lot of these guys that were part and parcel of getting these, Scott Adams, a lot of these guys that are part of the new right. Again, notice that I didn't mention any of the neocons, because the neocons were all for Hillary. They were all never Trumpers, right? And they essentially it was the last nail in their coffin by going for not only either going for Hillary Clinton or trying to sabotage Trump by running people in certain places like Evan McMullin and silly things like that. So think of, the Bill Kristols of the world and some of those folks. Again, neocons. So this new right is very interesting. Like I said, they're not very interested in religion in terms of putting it out there. So they're not, the type of conservatives that you would think of, like Jerry Falwell or those types of folks. They're basically not interested in religion. Now, they're not even that interested in economics, which is crazy to me. This is really, really funny. I mean, look at how they're falling for all this protectionism, all this protectionist policies that Trump is talking about. So they're not, free marketeers per se. A lot of them are actually explicitly anti-free market. That's more of like the nationalist side of that. You only need to read or listen to Vox Day for more of an insight into that. And they're not even for small government anymore. Now they're, let's protect our military, let's protect our police, let them do their job, let them, clean up the streets. And so they no longer are about, if we need to increase the government in order to do all those things. Again, you need a police state to do all the things that they want to do with immigration. I mean, if you want to be able to monitor every square inch of the border, if you want to build a border that is, almost 3,000 miles long, if you want to do all those things, you need a big, fat, powerful government, right? So the things to kind of differentiate here with the new right and the alt-right, on top of the ones that I've already mentioned, is that the new right, again, since they're not interested in all of those other things that you would usually expect the right to be interested in, so that they're pretty much all about preserving Western values. They don't care about any of the other things that I discussed. They say, for now, all we want to preserve Western values. All of the things that the left tells us they hate. And ironically, all of the things that have made it possible for them to hate all those things and be able to complain about all those things and be able to be, activists and protest and all those things. Guess what? All of those things are only possible thanks to, Western values, which are, the modern Western values from the Enlightenment, which means, the right to life, liberty, and property, and those type of things. So that's all we care about. That's kind of the biggest thing. We just want to preserve Western values. Now, the alt-right is a different story. The alt-right, they might, pay some lip service to those type of things because they are also, proud of the Western culture and Western civilization heritage. But more important to them is nationalism and ethnicity. All right? So they do see themselves as, hey, you have to understand that these Western values are white values. These came from, these are European-centric values. These are part and parcel of who we are as people. And we essentially need to protect ourselves. And we need to be able and be left alone. And we need to be allowed to preserve our heritage and our, ethnicity, our race. Okay? And not necessarily to the extent that, a full-on Nazi would, in the terms that they call for, genocide or to just round people up and take them somewhere, whatever. They just say, you know what? It stops here. And we're, if it means stopping more people from coming in that are not, from Eurocentric cultures and countries, we'll stop it right here, and we will kind of change the demographics back to what they should be by not letting these people in anymore, by making sure that, our fellow whites or whatever have an easier time at it. And the way that they will do it, many of these are national socialists. So they're not against socialism per se. They just say, yeah, the socialism that exists should be for the benefit of other fellow white people, right? So yeah, I don't care about a welfare state. Let's have a welfare state. But you know what? I only want to have that welfare state if it helps, my fellow white people, all right? So a lot of nationalism, national socialism, and that's the difference between that new right and the alt-right. So, well, what do we make of that? Well, now we have this clash of cultures. We had this very large swing to the left, reacted to that very large swing to the right. And so now we find ourselves in a climate in which, again, because the left still has so much power with things like the media and Hollywood and academia and all these things, and even now in tech, right? Social media, all of these platforms are owned by social justice warrior billionaires. So again, they have a lot of power, even if numbers-wise they might not be as large as we would think they are. They have a lot of reach, a lot of power, and so they've come to the point where anything that is not left is fascist. So that's where the left is today, as I'm recording this. Anything that is not explicitly left is to them fascist. They call it fascist. They will call you a Nazi if you disagree with them. And again, does this surprise anyone? Remember, under the Obama years, if you ever disagreed with Obama, you were called a racist. So the merits of your arguments did not matter one bit. It didn't matter if it was about foreign policy, if it was about economics, if it was about culture. It didn't matter. If you ever said anything negative about Barack Obama, it could only be because you hate black people, right? I know we've mentioned this before. He's as much black as he is white, right? He's half white, half black. So this is completely ludicrous. You couldn't even have a conversation with these people because they would write you off as a racist. So now everybody's a racist. Now the problem here, or not even the problem, what they have now achieved is that now anybody calling you racist means absolutely nothing, because they've basically turned that word completely worthless and ineffective. But so now their new one is fascist or Nazi. So they go. Just mentioning Richard Spencer and one of those protests or riots or whatever that they had after the inauguration. Some Antifa thug cold-cocked Richard Spencer, and everybody in the left was, isn't that funny? Punch a Nazi, everybody, we need to punch Nazis. And they started again, it's just so ridiculous that I can't even comprehend it, because not only have these people always held themselves to be, pacifists and loving, understanding, whatever. Now all of them on the left are calling for, hey, punch a Nazi. It's okay. If he's a Nazi, you can cold cock him and blah, blah, blah. Again, not when you're being aggressed upon, just out of the blue, just punch him in the face. So, as much as I disagree with Richard Spencer, I think he's a clown. For them to say that, yeah, it's okay to just out in the street, you see him, punch him in the face, right? Again, these are leftist people, all right? Now, I also found it funny, by the way, that they started posting all of these different things about, hey, our grandfathers, they fought Nazis, and they started posting pictures of things like comic books with Captain America like punching Hitler in the face, and all these different cartoons and things of our grandfathers fought in World War II and they killed Nazis and they punched Nazis. And I'm like, yeah, these are also the people that you keep telling us are the problem. Our grandfathers who are racist, backward thinkers, that until they die off, you're not going to have control until all of those people die off. But now they're your heroes because they punched Nazis in the 40s. So which is it? Are they heroes and you want to emulate what they do? Or are they old racist people that are set in their ways and that need to go away so that people can vote Democrat for the rest of history? But again, so that's why we now come into the issue of... Oh, and by the way, I wanted to also mention the fact that when I was talking about the fact that everything that is not left is now fascist or Nazi, notice how the left, when they want to insult someone, they call him Hitler or Nazi or fascist. But yet they never mention Stalin or Mao. And these are people that killed many times more people than Hitler, right? These were people that history will tell you were, in orders of magnitude more heinous and committed more atrocities than even Hitler. And yet you never hear them use, call someone Stalin as a pejorative or Mao as a pejorative. Why? Because they were on the left. Okay? Because they don't want to have people associate those atrocities with the left, which they were. They were leftist movements, the communist movements, whether it be Stalin, Mao, Fidel Castro, whether it be Ho Chi Minh, whether it be Pol Pot in Cambodia, all those movements that all up have been responsible for many more deaths than, fascists, Hitler being the worst, really. I mean, the other fascists didn't kill nearly as many people, Mussolini or Franco or Pinochet. I mean, it's nothing in comparison to the left-wingers, the extreme left-wingers, the communists. But again, no mention ever. So I also find that really funny and very, very hypocritical. And but again, it's to be expected. But it's also funny about the new right and the alt-right is that they are now using leftist tactics. So if you think about when we think about conservatives or right-wingers, we always hear these button-up guys and they say, oh, they take the low road, we take the high road. So even though the left has, for the last 20, 30 years, has been doing nothing but berating conservatives in the movies, on television, in literature, in the media, in academia, they always, we take the high road and, we don't answer back any of that stuff and blah, 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 right? Well, not the new right, not the alt-right. They're basically turning the tables on the left and saying, we're going to use Saul Alinsky type tactics. We're going to berate you. We're going to make fun of you. We're going to poke at you. We're going to do everything that you've been doing to us for the last, couple decades. We're going to do it right back at you. And we're no longer going to be PC. We're not going to take the high road. We're going to go even lower than you. And you've been seeing that a lot in, especially on social media and all these new outlets where people can just say whatever it is that they want, and it's game on. I mean, it's completely game on. So, to get kind of back where I started here in saying that I think that this presents to us a situation where I think the left is more, it's more of a threat now than the right, because at least the new right is willing to have these conversations, right? At least the new right is willing to would be willing to have people speak to these things and debate and all that kind of stuff. And even if they're wrong or have certain blind spots about certain topics, certain areas, they're willing to have the conversation. They're willing to be out in the open and have these arguments and all of that stuff, whether it be PC or not, it doesn't matter. The problem is that the left, not so much. At this point, they would rather punch you in the face. At this point, they would rather kick you out of college or out of the arena of public discourse. They would rather you be just outright dismissed, fired, destroyed, whatever it is, as opposed to actually having a war of ideas. All right? And that's where we are today. All right? And they have literally shown their colors and how in showing how inconsistent and contradictory their worldview is, that you're now starting to see this cannibalism. They're eating their own now because they've been all over the place just picking up the mantle for every person, every group that they see as being marginalized, that now you're starting to see how all of those interests overlap and contradict each other, that now they're in a battle between themselves. Like, I mean, just talk about when we're talking about equality, right, which is the underpinning of leftist ideology. You see feminists talking about how, they're literally turned into misandrists. They just hate men. It's no longer about equality. It's about men are bad. Rape culture. If you're a man, you're either a rapist or a rape apologist. There's no other thing there. It's just, that's all you can be. I mean, equality for feminists. What do you mean? There's no room for conservative women in feminist movements. Just look at the Women's March, right? They kicked out this pro-life group of conservative women. They didn't even let them in the march. They didn't let any conservative women speak. So what equality? They're all about women. Oh, and pussy power and the little pussy hats and all this and that. And well, what does that say to trans women, right? So they don't have vaginas. And aren't they supposed to be? Again, leftists tell us we're all equal and we have to accept everybody and all that stuff. Are they not women? Well, they have penises. So what are you going to do about that? Right? And what about fighting for our reproductive rights? Well, a trans woman has no reproduction things. They have no ovaries. They have no. What do you make of them? You're triggering them. You're offending them, are you not? Right? Now, the left also recently took on the mantle of Muslims. So the Muslims are completely beyond reproach. They can do or say anything. And then meanwhile, Christianity is fair game to be completely just obliterated everywhere, in every form, every media, every outlet, whatever. Christianity, they'll stomp on it all they want, but it doesn't matter what any Muslim says or does, they need to be protected. Okay, they keep telling us that Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. Meanwhile, if some kook blows up an abortion clinic, it's because it's Christianity. That's what Christianity preaches, right? They're apologists for people that call for Sharia law. Look at gays. Gays are no longer even their pet project for the left. Why? Because they already achieved marriage equality. They can serve in the military. All the things that they kept using as cudgels for, to beat people over the head with, they achieved it. So now they've basically told the gays to go F themselves, literally. And now they've actually picked Islam over gays. So the one culture that even the mainstream is not very open about, and it's not very tolerant of, they've now chosen them. So now the gays are now saying, hey, wait a second, what's going on? What are you doing here? Right? Again, this cannibalism it's going to keep happening. In terms of race, now they're out and they're explicitly saying whites are evil. Whites are wrong. Look at Twitter, look at Facebook, look at all these things that people in the mainstream, in people who are leaders in movements like Black Lives Matter, like the New Black Panthers, like Nation of Islam. They say we want safe spaces, which is basically segregation. Weren't they against that during the times of Jim Crow? Isn't that what they were fighting against? But now they want safe spaces outside and far from white people. They want to be by themselves. And there's no disavowal from any mainstream leftist anywhere of all these people that say this stuff. Just last week there in Toronto, there was a one of the founders of Black Lives Matter in Canada, and she was out there saying, whites are basically a genetic defect, right? Another Black Lives Matter person was basically going off on Justin Trudeau. I mean, the biggest lefty social justice warrior, national leader one could ever think of. Also, by the way, a poster boy for white privilege, ironically enough. And they were calling him a tyrant and all these things. And it's like, wait, he's on your side. And they're already going against him. All right. So you have all of these things that are basically, they're constantly contradicting themselves. They're now at each other's throats in many ways. And the reason is that they don't think like we freedom-minded individuals who try to use natural law. We look to reason and logic. We look to first principles, because those are the things that give us the stability, that give us that baseline from which we can start building something that on a good foundation. They do it completely the opposite way. It's about feelings. It's about subjectivity. It's about what feels right. It's about patting yourself on the back and virtue signaling. It's about optics. It's about everything that is superficial. And so all of that is very, very dangerous, my friends. And that's why, right now, as things are, I think that if we are to be able to keep this conversation going, if we are able to ever reach a point where we have more freedom, when we are freer individuals, I'm sorry, but we must fight leftism today, as things stand right now. Now, that doesn't mean that we give the right a pass, because we shouldn't. And I think you're going to start hearing me and talking and holding the right's feet to the fire, and especially Trump's feet to the fire, and more as time goes on. But I want people to at least know where I'm coming from, because I don't want everybody to think, oh yeah, he might as well just be a conservative, because I'm not. There is no such thing as conservatism anymore, guys. There's no such thing as conservatism. There's only right wing. Conservative means that you, again, are about localism, about tradition, about Christianity, that you are about all these different things. None of that. There's none of that to be conserved anymore. It's just right wing. It's right wing reactionary. Okay? Right wing reactionaryism, if that's even a thing. Like I said, action, reaction. Right now, the right wing is just reacting to the situations on the ground, to the circumstances, which is they are being attacked by the left to such a degree that they're saying we're fighting back. Okay, and I want to add just a little bit to that fact and that situation. We understood, again, back to action and reaction. Do we understand then in the 50s and prior to the 50s that black people felt oppressed, that black people did not have the same rights, that black people were second, maybe even third class citizens in the United States? I think yes, we understand that is the case. So would we be surprised when essentially, there was that blowback from blacks, and we saw things in the 60s like the original Black Panthers and Black Power and all that kind of stuff? No, that doesn't surprise me. They stood up. They reacted to the actions of the circumstances back then. So why would it not stand to reason that after 20, 30 plus years of the left telling white people, white males, white male Christians, that you're evil, that just for the mere fact of you being born white, you have privilege, just for the mere fact of being born a white male, you're a rapist or rape apologist, that just for the fact of being born a white male Christian, you're an Islamophobe, how would we not expect people to essentially at some point stand up and say, enough? Of course we would expect it. Of course we would expect that some of those people are going to take it to an extreme and call for, crazy solutions, right? But again, that's just a fringe minority. The majority of them are saying, we're not going to take it anymore. We have the right, just like everybody else, to fight for what we believe is right, for what we believe is ours. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the other people don't have the same right too. They're only just standing up and are affirming and reaffirming it. Okay? The other thing to consider here when it comes to, that topic is the left is very hypocritical when it comes to people that try to defend themselves that way, because it's only, again, white people that when they do that they call them, racist, bigots, homophobes, misogynists, blah, 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 everything down the line. And yet every other group, every other minority in the United States already has a place where they can go to if they wanted to and be with their own people, right? So if you're an Asian, if you're a Chinese, if you're Vietnamese, if you're Japanese, if you're black, if you're Hispanic, if you're whatever it is that you are, you can go back to wherever it is and be surrounded by people that look just like you. Every single one of those people can do it today. Where do the white people from the United States go to? They have nowhere to go. Europe is going through the exact same thing. Say, oh, well, go back to Ireland, go back to Germany, go back to what? Well, guess what? They're having the exact same thing, and the left is doing the exact same thing. Europe is also going through exact same problems that the United States is going through. So why wouldn't you expect for people to have this kind of reaction? Okay? So that doesn't mean that we need to agree with everything they say. It doesn't mean that we have to accept, every complaint if it has no merit. But again, we need to at least understand and expect that would be the case. Okay? So then what you might ask me then, what the heck is the solution to this? The solution is, there are two possible ways that this is going to work itself out. One, which is what I hope happens, is that this is going to be a war of attrition in which the left and the right are going to become so strident, and there's going to be really no winner here, that eventually they're both sides are going to give up, and they're going to say, you know what, do whatever the hell you want to do. Just leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. And what that means is that essentially, hopefully, that means that people will just stop using, especially the centralized federal government, to tell other people how to live, and actually get back to true federalism and allow that decentralization to the point where, people in their individual states can actually form the communities that they want, the societies that they want, and just do their thing and compete in the marketplace. And hey, if our state, we're showing you how we live, and look how much happier we are than you, and look how much wealthier we are than you. Hey, here it is. Proof is in the pudding, right? Or hey, you're a completely failed state. You put into place all the things that you said would work, and it's not working. Hey, there it is. Why don't you copy us? All right, or come live with us and live how we live, and you'll see that you'll be more successful, right? Or two, which is probably more likely, but I hope that it doesn't really happen that way, is that there's going to be a huge economic reset that's going to force us into that. Meaning that once the government or governments, whether it's Europe, whether it's the United States, all of these governments that are so in debt, that are spending so much money, that are printing so much money, all of these economic systems that are unsustainable, that once all of that implodes and those checks start coming, those checks stop coming, Social Security, welfare, food stamps, you name it. Once all of that stuff stops occurring, and people finally have to go back to take care of themselves, take care of their families, take care of their communities, and focus on the things that really matter, and actually trying to be productive, that then essentially you get the same result that I said before. But it's kind of like, you want it the easy way or the hard way. The easy way would be for all of us right now to just leave each other alone, leave each other be, and that we interact with each other in the marketplace. And then we don't need to interact with anybody else that we don't want to. We have, again, freedom, right? It could be done tomorrow if we really wanted to. So that's unlikely to happen. So what's going to happen is we're going to be forced into it. And the reason why I think that under such a huge economic collapse or huge economic reset, that I don't think we'd go back to a type of, dark age, if you will, like we have in several points throughout history, is that now we have the tools that will allow us to be able to coexist and to survive those type of things. I mean, you can't turn back the clock on the internet. You can't turn back the clock on television, on cell phones, on smartphones especially, on video, on audio, on any of that stuff. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. All of that now exists, which means that all you need to do is break down those avenues of control, of power over us. And once those things collapse, we still have all the tools, and we still have the knowledge. We still have the know-how. And that's what's going to go and fill the void. At least I hope that's how it happens. All right, guys, thanks for hanging in there. I know it was a long episode. I hope I made some sense, and that you made some sense out of what I said. Again, a lot of stuff to cover in the news, and hopefully I'll be able to get on the behind the mic in a couple of days and talk more about current affairs and Trumpisms and all that good stuff. All right, talk to you soon. If you want to know how you can help me keep the show going, or if you have a question, comment, or recommendation, you can contact me directly or through social media. Find out how to do all that by visiting Manumission.com.